It's entitled, Who Are True Christians? Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. Jesus Christ said in chapter 10 of the Gospel of St. John, "All that ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them." Many Christians, not surprisingly, quote this saying in condemnation of other spiritual teachers, not only the Old Testament prophets, but also Buddha, Krishna, and others who lived before Jesus, as well as, by inference, any who came after him. Yet Jesus said in St. Matthew chapter 5, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill." Now, where do we find Jesus condemning or even gently criticizing other spiritual masters? His criticisms were reserved for worldly attitudes and for those hypocritical Pharisees who had allowed religion to become for them a pretense. Paramahansa Yogananda explained that the expression, "all that ever came before me," referred to those spiritual teachers who placed their egos and their self-importance ahead of the Christ consciousness, in the sense of drawing people's devotion to themselves and not offering it where alone it truly belongs, to God. Yogananda himself was very firm in this regard. For example, he never spoke of anyone as his disciple. Instead, he always insisted, "They are God's disciples. God is the guru, not I." Ego is a way station of the soul's journey toward enlightenment. The soul is first trapped in lower bodily forms. Slowly it evolves to the human level, at which point self-consciousness appears. Only in human form can self-consciousness transcend material form altogether, including the lower identity of ego consciousness, and discover the true divine self within. Self-consciousness manifested as ego as an incentive to deliberate self-development. Later in this process of development, however, the ego became an obstruction. Inevitably, new spiritual aspirants do not emerge effortlessly from the vortex of ego consciousness. Desire must be offered up resolutely and even more wholeheartedly on the altar of infinity. It is a gradual process, and few, even among those who seek to help others, are free of ego. If, however, their motive in teaching is not to serve but to be served, they deserve a severe reprimand, as Jesus gave them. For their direction of development is no longer upward, but downward. In the name of giving up desires, they are creating new ones. As it says in the Bhagavad Gita in the 3rd chapter, "Desire obscures even the wisdom of the wise. The relentless foe it is, a flame never quenched." Intellect, mind, and senses, these combined are referred to as the seat of desire. Desire, through them, deludes and eclipses the discrimination of the embodied soul. O Arjuna, discipline your senses, and having done so, work to destroy desire, annihilator of wisdom and of self-realization. Give God the credit for everything you do. See Him as the doer. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om.
Good morning again. I'd like to begin with a reading from Whispers from Eternity. This is a book of prayer poems by Paramahansa Yogananda. This one is entitled, "Make Me Feel That Everything is Joy." I am the foam of happiness spumed out of the sea of thy joy. I am the ocean life bounding with the billows of joy. Endless eddies of my laughter spread through all hearts. When the time comes to depart, I will retire to wakeful sleep on the bosom of thine infinite joy, a ripple ever dancing with billows of all joy. I am a bubble of joy, struggling to burst and unite with the ocean of joy. I feel thy joy in all things. Make me a lighthouse of joy also, guiding storm-tossed vessels of life to safety on the shores of thy joy. Let every vine of my activity bear large grape clusters of thy joy. Let me drink the divine wine pressed from the grapes of all life's little joys. Isn't that so colorful? Yogananda's imagery is always so vibrant and fun. So, this morning's reading, Who Are the True Christians, covers a lot of interesting territory, both historically or in the context of Christianity, and also in terms of practicality. What is it that we need to take of this into our own lives? And I almost wonder if Jesus was intentionally trying to confuse the audience that he was speaking to, or intentionally trying to confuse people who, centuries later, how would they possibly take his words any other way than that? All that came before me were thieves and robbers. I mean, it's not that difficult to see why it could be interpreted as any other teacher that spoke before me was a thief and a robber. It seems pretty straightforward. And so he himself spoke at different times in parables, like the famous parable of the mustard seed. And he said, for he that hath ears to hear, let him hear. And he said, the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed. And the disciples said, yes, yes. And he said, do you get it? And they said, no. And he said, do you not understand even this? And then he goes on to explain how the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, because it's, first of all, it's an inner thing. I can't explain it that well. I have to go back and read it. But that it is a potential, that it is from a very tiny seed, it grows within us into an infinite experience. And so a few times he troubled to explain his parables, but otherwise he spoke this way, knowing that those who had the intuition to either understand what he meant, then they could follow him, or else those who said, I don't understand any of it, but I feel your power, I feel your magnetism, I feel happier when I'm in your presence, and so I'll understand it one day. That's often how more effective spiritual teaching can be, is through the magnetic exchange between people. I feel better when I do this, therefore I do it. And I'll learn all the reasons why someday. Martin, could I ask you to turn the temperature down a little bit? Not the AC down, the temperature down. Yeah, sorry. Right there, right by your hand, right there. Just the down part. So, if he said, all that came before me are thieves and robbers, then how does that jive with, I think not that I have come to destroy the prophets. I have not come to destroy, but to fulfill. So these are two contradictory statements. I am fulfilling the teachings of the prophets, and yet all that came before me are thieves and robbers. And so Yogananda explained the answer to that, and we'll get into that into a moment. But first, we can understand this sort of conflict between spiritual teachers. It seems rather apparent, and it's not limited at all to Christianity or Judaism. In India, when I was learning Indian philosophy, I was learning Indian philosophy in America, but it happened in India, and my professor said there was the spiritual teaching of a teacher named Shankara, and he taught that all is one. And everyone said, yes, all is one. And later on, several centuries later, another teacher came along and said, his name was Ramanuja, and he said, no, it's not all one. There's sort of duality, that there's sort of God and his creation, and they really are one, but it's helpful to think of them as separate. and that there's a spark of the divine in each one of us, but it's still all one. And so everyone said, okay, that makes more sense. And then Buddha came along and said, there is no God. And everyone said, okay. And then another teacher later, Chaitanya, came along and he said, just chant, forget all this philosophy and is one and is it there and not, just sing God's name and you'll be free. So all of these different teachers, so my professor explained, each had their own school of thought, and all of these schools competed and had their rise in the sun, and then they decayed when a new popular teacher came and said some other version, some other truth. And I thought, well, that doesn't sound unlike the sort of sectarianism you can see in other religions. But it was Yogananda who explained that these great teachers were not at all in conflict with each other. Why is it a problem if they are? Well, it's a problem if they were in conflict because we think, well, does anyone know what they're talking about? I mean, do they themselves know what they're talking about? If we could say it's this way, no, it's that way, well, it's this way, then how does anyone know? And which one are we supposed to believe? The one that gets sort of the most votes by the Electoral College, they're the ones who then are the right ones of the day? Of course not. Truth should be truth, regardless of our opinions of it. And so, Yogananda explained that each teacher came to correct an imbalance that was creeping into the society at that time. At the time that Shankara came, people were worshipping all the different forms of gods as separate, as a pantheon, as this is the god of this and this is the god of that, as often is mistaken of Hinduism, that each god is sort of different and so on. And in fact, they are all one. All are different manifestations of the same God. So that's the understanding that he brought. Then after a time, people began to say, well, it's all a dream, it's all one, it's all God's dream, so what does it matter if I steal this? I'm stealing this in the dream, putting it in my dream pocket, and if you were upset, well, it's all just a dream. And so Ramanuja came along to say, well, yes, it is a dream, but it's helpful to think of our own separate reality too, and that our behavior matters. Yogananda said, yes, it's all a dream, and if you have a dream that you bang your head against a wall, your dream head will hurt. And so it's helpful to behave properly in the dream. And then Buddha came at a time when people were saying, let God do everything for us. Let us just pray that he will give us wealth. Let us pray that he will free us. If it is his pleasure to free me, great. If it isn't, oh well, it's not my fault. It's all up to him. And Buddha said, your effort too is needed. These are the things that you need to subject yourself to receive his grace. And so because there was such an overdependence on God in his time, of Buddha's time, Yogananda explained, therefore Buddha didn't mention God at all. Said, what can you do? And of course, then that was mistaken to be, well, Buddha was an atheist. He didn't believe in God. Simple question, if Buddha was such an atheist, where did his compassion come from? I mean, if there's no God and it's all just matter-born and everything, then why be nice to anyone? Where could that depthless compassion come from? A spirit of Dharma, exactly. And where does Dharma lead us? Sorry, no, let's talk after. So, then the question is, what about Chaitanya? Chaitanya came when everyone was debating about philosophy. The subtleties of philosophy, my philosophy versus your philosophy. And he roamed the countryside singing to God. And he met another Indian teacher, whose name I've forgotten at the moment, and he said to him, seeing this radiant young man, that it's wonderful that you're singing to God, and it's wonderful that you're so devoted, but it would be nice for you to learn some philosophy too. And he said, let me explain to you how helpful philosophy can be and what it would be like to actually understand it. So he took one statement, I think it might have been from the Bhagavad Gita, And he interpreted it in 32 different ways. And this was a huge feat, for in India, the emphasis on how much philosophical acumen you've developed is on how many different ways you can apply a truth. It's the opposite of the Aristotelian logic that says this is the one meaning. This is what the writer meant, this is what this means only. It doesn't mean that, it doesn't mean that, it means this. And in India, it's just the opposite. It means this and that and this and that. As above, so below, as the Hermetic doctrine. You can apply a truth on many different levels. So, this philosopher impressed Chaitanya with his 32 different interpretations. And Chaitanya said, let me see if I can think of even one other. And he came up with 80 others. This teacher didn't realize that Chaitanya had been a deep student of philosophy as a young man before he, quote-unquote, gave it all up, saying the ultimate is to open your heart to God. And so, this teacher ended up becoming Chaitanya's student. Now, in terms of thinking of this as it applies to spiritual teachers, well, we have to apply our own discrimination, our own intuition, our own sense of, is this the truth? And even if it is the truth, does it resonate with me? Is this my truth? We're not all going to be on the same path. We're not all going to be inspired by the same things. And what is very important is to not impose our inspirations on others, to not take on, to feel imposed upon by others' inspirations, but also to make sure that we are inspired. We have to find something that draws us upward, and that is in response to our hunger, the hunger in our hearts. Now, why is it that spiritual teachers have this challenge that Christ said, that all that ever came before me were thieves and robbers? Yogananda explained, anyone who places their own ego before their soul consciousness, before their Christ consciousness, in fact, which is certainly, until we're liberated, all of us, but especially in the role of a spiritual teacher, when anyone starts to say, well, it's so wonderful that you're coming, and it's so wonderful that you're enjoying, and I think I have something to do with that. Whoops. Suddenly we are placing ourselves before the source. Swami Kriyananda had a beautiful experience that illustrates this. He had, and in his office in Mount Washington, he had a huge picture window that looked out into a garden. And while he was working, he would pause every now and then and just gaze through the window, enjoy the flowers and the beauty outside for more inspiration before going back to work. One day there was a terrible rainstorm, as there can be in LA, and it splashed all kinds of mud onto the window and obscured the view behind it. And so every time when Swami would stop and look up at his window, he would see the mud. And he said he made a resolution to go out there and clean that window, and after about 2 weeks he found some time when he could do so. And he cleaned it, and when he got back to his office and he looked at the window, he said, "What a beautiful window." And then he smiled, because he realized what made the window beautiful is that he could no longer see it, is that he could see through it at the beautiful flowers and so on. And so that is what a spiritual teacher brings. Now, all of us are trying to work our way out of bondage, as I was describing earlier with the chant. We're all trying to find our own freedom. And so we have to be careful, because in the beginning we can say, whether we're in the role of direct spiritual teaching, or whether we're just talking to friends, or whether we're just talking to ourselves, and saying, for example, you can imagine in the role of a spiritual teacher, it's important not to have likes and dislikes. And everyone says, yes. And then we can start to think, oh, I like that. What else can I say that will make people clap? See, the ego is so tricky. Anytime we expand, anytime we move beyond the ego and feel the freedom from all of this, how does everything relate back to me? Do people like it? Yes, finally I can feel happy. Do they not like it? Oh, now I have to feel miserable. This roller coaster, when we're externally identified, has nothing to do with whether we're spiritual teachers or not. It's to do with any time we're externally identified, of course. But we feel that freedom from that, as I was saying earlier, perhaps in meditation. And then it comes crashing back in. Or we say, I had such a good meditation. I am a good meditator. I think I will write a little pamphlet on how to be a good meditator like me. The ego is so clever at drawing those blessings and saying, forget God, I am the source. After all, I was clever enough to meditate in the first place. So, how do we get out of it? Or what causes it? This is where the Gita reading comes in. Desire. That in some cases, if we're having a good time, we can have the desire that that time continue, and we can even start to get a little frantic, like, I hope it continues because I know it won't. But why is desire so bad? I mean, I remember once being at a New Year's Eve party, and we were doing some weird, silly kind of games, and someone said, if you could be free of one thing in your life, what would it be? And I said, desire. And they all said, what? God, have a beer. Desire is like the spice of life. It's like what gives meaning to everything. And yet I could also see in many of them a tiredness, and on some deeper level in knowing that, as Yogananda said, desires ever fed are never dead. Never satisfied. So why? Swami explains on one point, a desire is our affirmation of lack. Just really interesting when I first read that. Desire is an affirmation of lack. In other words, I want this, and I don't have it. There's the lack. I need to acquire this to have it, then I will no longer lack that particular thing. And of course, this may sound theoretical, but we all know when we feel peaceful, happy, calm, fulfilled, whether it's on vacation or whether it's after meditation, and we think, I don't really want anything. I feel perfectly peaceful and happy just right now in the way that I am. And it's a dynamic peace. It's not, I feel perfectly peaceful and happy, it's not that we're out cold or numb. It's that we feel that completeness. I remember someone early on in my college years said to me, there are some times when you're happy for no reason. And I said, huh? No reason? Has to be a reason. And it took me some time before I experienced that I feel happy for no reason. I feel happy because I am. Once there was an interviewer who was challenging Swami Kriyananda and said, what about atheism? They were talking about all these different topics, and finally she just said, something like, and what was it like to be with Yogananda in 1952? And what about atheism? Just like, what? Where did that come from? And he said, basically, what about it? And she said, there are many, the school of atheism is rising, and people are saying, that things are, consciousness is a product of matter and produced by the brain, and that when the body dies, so consciousness is extinguished, and they found all these near-death experiences, which tend to, contradict that, but they say, well, it's because they're sort of outgassing that the brain does, or electrical discharges that make them all have the same exact experience. Anyway, never mind. That it's all just a hoax. And Swami said, well, I have a question for them. Are they happy? And she said, Well, I've talked to them and them, I don't know who they were, but still, certainly I'm sure they were proponents of atheism. And she said, I've talked to them and they're happy because they feel they're being honest, they feel they're being true to their experience, they're being true to reality, and Swami cut her off and said, and I am happy without having to say because. I remember an atheist who was wrangling with me once, and I had been brought up an atheist, so it was no scourge to me at all. I said, sure, I used to think that way too. And he began by telling me that when he was 8 years old, he had an incredible fear of death. And just nightmares, he was beside himself. They were, the parents were thinking about medication at a certain point. And this is in India, which means it had gotten really drastic. And someone gave him Autobiography of a Yogi, and he read the book, and he said, I feel at peace. And his fear of death went away. Then he, after practicing Yogananda's teachings for some time, he became a Christian and followed that path. And so I said, oh, that's wonderful. And he said, yes, I had this church that I went to and so on. And he said, and now I'm an atheist. And I said, okay, all right. And he said, I could see him kind of like, okay, now here we get into it. And so he started slowly picking apart everything about religion, God, and truth, and Jesus, and everything. And he said at one point, for example, you know where the smile came from, don't you? I said, what? He said, well, primitive man, of course, was always, whenever he would see any threat, he would go and bare his teeth like a gorilla, because that's where, humans came from. And then he would start, when someone would approach him, he would, but then he would see that it was actually a friend, and so he would go, and that's where the smile came from. It's, oh God, Okay, I wasn't there when the first human being smiled, so I don't know if that's true or not. But I'm inclined to think, anyway, never mind. There's a certain point where what does it matter? So anyway, he was slowly picking apart things like this, and I could feel that if I were to tense up and say, well, don't be ridiculous, that he would say, I have won. So I had to breathe throughout the whole thing. And only once did he sort of get, a little too blasphemous, like, I beg your pardon, but at least you will be respectful. And he said, okay, sorry. And he stepped back from where that particular trajectory. I also felt in this man that he had a good heart. I don't mean to say that, people don't have good hearts, but I could feel his sincerity. He wanted to know the truth. And I also felt he was kind and sincere. He wasn't just arguing for the sake of arguing, which so many do. And so I thought, okay, I was raised as a mathematician. If something isn't true, then there must be a loophole in it. And so there's got to be a loophole in this reasoning for this guy. And so I just, I was just praying, Master, help me see the loophole. And so he was going through all of this stuff, and I'm just, this is about a 5-hour lunch. So I was really kind of really trying. Then he called a taxi, but the taxi didn't come, as happens in India. And so it was just like on and on and on. And finally, I was getting fatigued, and I said, Master, give me something. And then I saw it, and I said to him, okay, so everything you're saying is true, let's say. Now, what about your fear of death? What would you say to someone who's afraid of death now, from this philosophy? And he said, and it was the first time he was silent in response to a question of mine. And he said, well, yeah. And then he said, well, that's this, famous, Mr. Famous atheist writer over here says, the price I have to pay for my beliefs is that I have no consolation to offer the dying man. Okay, sure enough. But it stopped him in his tracks at that time. And it wasn't my goal to stop him in his tracks, but to help him see according to his own logic that there was something at least that was being unfulfilled. So, going back to why do we put this desire as an affirmation of lack? What is the cure for all of this? Well, it's what we've just been talking about. If we feel happy for no reason, then we don't lack anything. Then we're not needing anything outward to fulfill us. If we feel happy for no reason, then at the moment all of our desires are stilled. Now, how do we get there? Because it's wonderful when we're there. But then how do we get back there when we're not there? Well, of course, as we all know, through meditation, through chanting, through service to others. Service to others. When we serve others, it's amazing. It has this whole side effect that we forget ourselves. And I don't know about you, but very often it's a great relief to forget myself and all my little preoccupations. So, I do want to add one other piece to this, though, that isn't explicitly mentioned in this reading. I think it's in the expanded reading. We should also be careful lest we be too critical of other spiritual teachers of other paths. To say, well, look at this person. They were all there and they were popular and then they all came crashing down around them. That's something America's really good at, is pulling people down or saying, see how... even though this person aspired to much more than I've ever tried, but he made one mistake, ha 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 ha, just like the rest of us, buddy. And so we should say, well, have they done more good than harm? I mean, have they inspired more people to look more deeply within themselves? Yes, I agree, there are certainly egregious examples, but they're not as plentiful as just people like you and me doing their best to do good in this world. The other reason why we should not be too critical is that if we are too critical and uncharitable, the karmic consequence of that is that we end up having to do it ourselves. And then we realize, oh, that's what happened. Oh, I can see how easy it is to actually slip in that same way that that person slipped. Now I will be more compassionate. This is the divine law. And it's just the way this school works. So, the more love we can offer, the more kindness we can offer, and the more we can say to God, this is your show, and I want to be free, and I want to know the truth, the happier we will be.